Hi everyone. So for my final discussion, I am basically going to do somewhat of a research proposal that incorporates all of the different topics that we've been learning over the semester in regards to research and educational research. So as you can see, I will be exploring student outcomes of foster youth with disabilities. And the reason that this has been my topic over the entire semester is because I was working on a grant through the university that allowed me to work with students who were in transition out of high school, students who had disabilities. And during one of our grant seminars, we focused an entire seminar to foster youth with disabilities. And it just really caught my attention. And the more that I learned about it, the more I realized there's actually a lack of research in this specific area and with this demographic. So I thought that it was an important topic to discuss. So I want to start off with the process of research. And there are 8 steps. And so I'm just going to go through each one because that is how I'm going to also go through with my research topic. So the first one is identifying a research problem. And that just looks like specifying the problem and justifying its importance. The second step is reviewing the literature. So you are selecting sources about the problem and you are evaluating and summarizing sources. Step 3 is specifying a purpose. So you are stating the study's intent and focus, and then you narrow the purpose to a research question or a hypothesis. The fourth step is choosing a research design. You are selecting an overall approach for the study, and then you're planning the study's methods. After that, step 5 is selecting participants and collecting data. So you are selecting sites and individuals to study, you are obtaining permission, and you are gathering information. For step 6, you are analyzing data and reporting results. So you are breaking down data, you're making sense of the data, you're representing the data so that others are able to understand it. In step 7, you are drawing conclusions. So you are relating the study results to the current literature, you are identifying any limitations to the study, and you are then suggesting any implications and things that can be drawn from the research. And the last step is disseminating and evaluating the research. So you're sharing the research with audiences and you're having the studies process assessed by audiences. So that is basically the 8 steps in the process of research. And then going from there, my topic question, my research question overall is which factors contribute to successful student outcomes in foster youth with disabilities transitioning out of high school? So it seems like a lot, it's kind of a mouthful, it's a long question, but we're going to break it down. We're going to go through what it would look like and how it would play out following the process of research. So we're going to start with the problem, and those are the first 3 steps. It kind of covers the problem. The first step, again, identifying a research problem. And so I'm going to go with justifying the importance. So students who are identified as foster youth and with disabilities face greater challenges due to lack of resources, support, and being a minority group. So when I think of students who are foster youth and have a disability, are identified with a disability, they're already a minority within a minority. So they are at less of an advantage. They have more disadvantages, they have greater challenges to overcome. And so that's why I think that this is an important topic to dive into, especially as educators. So looking into step 2, which is reviewing the literature, you're reviewing different sources. And as I mentioned before, when I was looking through this topic, I noticed that there was a lot there was a lack of research, specifically when it comes to foster youth with disabilities. There's research about foster youth, there's research about, people or students with disabilities who are going through transition, the transition period out of high school. But specifically, foster youth with disabilities together is a group or a population that does not have a lot of research. Most of what I found was looking kind of at foster parents, but not very much concrete research on specifically both foster youth with disabilities and their student outcomes when it comes to transitioning out of high school. So because of that, now we're specifying a purpose and we're narrowing the purpose down. So I have identified that the problem, the overall problem, is going to be narrowed down to identifying which specific factors contribute to the successful outcomes of students who are identified as foster youth with disabilities. So I'm making it a lot more specific, taking it from a broad topic of there is disadvantages for this group to specifically what is affecting their successful student outcomes. So from there on, now that we have the problem and the research question finalized, then you need to start looking at how you're going to design your research. And what we've learned over the semester is that there are two main branches of research, which is quantitative versus qualitative data or research. So quantitative data is kind of the numbers form of research, right? So it's a type of research in which the researcher studies a problem that calls for an explanation about variables, decides what to study, asks specific narrow questions, collects quantifiable data from participants, analyzes these numbers using statistics and graphs, and conducts the inquiry in an unbiased, objective manner. So going through the book, some of the key words that you will see when you're discussing quantitative data is words like experiment, correlation, survey, variable, factors, association, and comparison. And qualitative data, kind of like that same idea of quantity versus quality. So quantity might be numbers based, quality is based on different factors. So a type of research in which the researcher studies a problem that calls for an exploration of a phenomenon, relies on the views of participants, asks broad, general questions, collects data consisting largely of words or text from participants, describes and analyzes these words for themes, and conducts an inquiry in a subjective and reflective manner. And some of the keywords that you'll see when it is qualitative data is a narrative, an ethnography, interview, observation, theme, case study. Having that information in mind, when I think about planning my research according to this specific research question and topic, for step 4, when I was choosing a research design, in selecting the overall approach, I decided that my question was looking at what the correlation was between the specific factors that play into the student outcomes of foster youth with disabilities. So given that, I decided that this would be a quantitative study. Specifically, it would most likely be a correlational design, maybe a little bit of a survey design, and this is a non-experimental research design, quantitative non-experimental research. So the correlational design, the intent is to describe the extent to which predictor variables relate to outcome variables, which essentially is what I'm looking at. I want to look at what variables will predict or lead to the successful outcomes, student outcomes. So then looking at step 5, selecting participants and collecting data. For this type of a study, I would be looking at demographic forms, performance measures, behavioral observation, and factual informational statements. So based off of my variables, this is the way that I would get my information. And I would look at stratified random sampling, which is when the researcher divides the population into subgroups and randomly selects participants from each group. The example that the book uses is a researcher obtains a list of all children placed in foster care in the city and then divides the list into groups by age and then randomly selects out of those groups. So similarly, I would do the same thing, looking at foster youth, and then specifically looking at foster youth with disabilities, and then specifically within that with students who are transitioning out of high school. So after that, I'm looking at my variables that I'm going to look at. So I chose these 5 variables, and they need to be further defined in order to be measurable, but just to get a gist of it, I would be looking at student self-determination, student involvement in IEPs, the foster family's involvement, the students' participation in school activities, and the students' access and use of resources, and looking at how all of each of these can affect the student outcomes. So then we get to the final part, which is the analyzing. And for step 6, which is analyzing data and reporting results, for my data analysis, I decided that it would be best to do a multiple regression unstandardized coefficient analysis. And that is because this is specifically used to provide a measure of the individual contribution of one unit of each independent variable to the dependent variable in a multiple regression analysis. So again, the example that the book uses is determining the individual contributions of GPA, SAT scores, and depression to predict the retention in first-year college students. So similarly, I'm looking at the independent variables that we saw in the last slide and how those are going to predict the successful student outcomes for foster youth with disabilities. And the results should emphasize inferential statistics. For step 7, when we're drawing conclusions, we're looking at the implications. So essentially the implication is that we are identifying which factors will best lead to successful outcomes, and then using that information to help shift our transition services or our curriculum in transition to kind of align with the factors to create the best scenario for students who are foster youth with disabilities. The last step is disseminating and evaluating research. So then the study and findings would be shared with school districts, with social workers, for their consideration when they are implementing their own transition services. So I think it's a pretty important topic, especially as educators who are trying to reach all students, and there's a variety of different students. So thank you.